This week I prayed and said, Lord, is there a different message that you would want me to give, considering everything that's been happening this week with Rick and Wanda and Catherine and so many things happening. And I received the green light to continue with this message, and I think I can see why, and I hope it will be a blessing and encouragement to us. In 1975, there was a child by the name of Raymond Dunn Jr. who was born in New York State. He had lots of physical difficulties just straight from birth. In fact, the Associated Press reports that at his birth, a skull fracture and oxygen deprivation caused severe retardation. But after he was born and as he grew, the family realized that he had a lot more physical difficulties than just that. He was both deaf and mute as well. He had up to 20 seizures a day in addition to that. And so he basically existed immobile in his bed. On top of all of that, as if that wasn't enough, he had food allergies, and the only food he could eat was this meat-based formula that was developed by Gerber Foods. It's the only thing that could feed him that didn't give him severe allergic reactions. In 1985, though, Gerber Foods discontinued that formula. And so Carol, his mother, scoured as many stores as she could, even in other states, to buy up this formula that she needed for her son to survive. But in 1990, she ran out. And Gerber had stopped producing it in 1985. So she ran out of this formula that was the only thing keeping her son alive. So she went to Gerber in desperation and explained the situation and asked if they would please continue or pick this production up again of this formula that they had stopped producing 5 years ago. And the employees of Gerber Food listened. They got out and donated all this volunteer time and hours. Voluntarily, they weren't paid for it, and they brought out all the old production equipment. And they set it all up. They got special permission from the USDA to produce this because that was needed as well. And this company, these employers, started to produce this only food for Raymond. Just one person they did this for. One boy. In fact, he was known as the Gerber boy because that was the only food he could eat. In 1995, Raymond Dunn Jr., known as the Gerber boy, died because of his physical problems. But during his brief lifetime, he called forth a wonderful thing called compassion. Compassion. And as demonstrated by the workers of Gerber, compassion is also not a sentimental word. You know, we think of comfort and compassion, those kind of words, kind of just like as a warm, fuzzy feeling. No. It goes beyond kind of thoughts of pity and takes action on behalf of another. That's what these Gerber workers did. True compassion. That's true of the New Testament word for compassion as well. And some of you have asked me about the sermon title, and that's why this is the explanation of that, okay? The New Testament word comes from a word that literally means to have the bowels moved. In other words, to be punched in the gut with something. To have the bowels move. That's why the title of the sermon is Bowel Movement. But I'm not speaking about number 2. I'm not trying to be gross. Okay? It was thought in New Testament times that the sense of compassion came from the bowels, from the guts. So that's why the word is related to that. From the guts. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus have this compassion again and again. In Matthew 14, Jesus has this compassion. He's moved in his bowels, okay? Moved with compassion for the crowds who don't have anything to eat, and he provides for them, and he heals those who are sick among the crowds. He does it again. He has that same compassion for the crowds in Matthew chapter 15 and feeds the 4,000 as well. He has the same compassion for two blind men in Matthew chapter 20, verse 34. And he has that compassion in our text this morning when he sees the crowds, how they're helpless and harassed. He has compassion for them. His bowels are moved. I'm going to be using that language because I want it to be fixed in your head that it's more than just a feeling we're talking about. More than kind of like seeing something sad on TV from, these dogs that need rescued or something. It's more than just this sense of pity, this sentimental feeling. This is one insight, the first insight about compassion. Compassion moves us to act on behalf of another person. And this is the compassion that's characteristic of Jesus' ministry. In fact, there's 3 parts of Jesus' ministry that are summarized both in Matthew 4 and Matthew 9. He gives himself to 3 primary activities: teaching, preaching, and healing. Healing is that compassion arm part of it, of his ministry. He taught in the synagogues, he proclaimed the good news of the gospel, and he healed those who came to him. It's part of his compassion towards the needy, the diseased, the sick, the demon-possessed, and all the people who came to him. And it's the same compassion that Jesus invites us to have towards those same people, the helpless and harassed, the sick and the broken, the lost and the hurting. And in fact, I would say to bring people to Jesus, as he'll go on to talk about our theme here, to bring people to Jesus, shouldn't God's people have the same compassion he has for the people he's asking us to go to? We find our text in Matthew chapter 9, verses 27 to 34 to begin with. This is the word of the Lord, and this is one example of Jesus' ministry of compassion. As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him, and he asked them, "Do you believe that I'm able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, will it be done to you?" And their sight was restored. Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But then they went out and spread the good news spread the news about him all over that region. While they were going out, a man who was demon-possessed and could not talk was brought to Jesus. And when the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke. And the crowd was amazed and said, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "It's by the prince of demons that he drives out demons." The word of the Lord. 2 specific examples are given here of Jesus' healing ministry, or this compassion arm of his ministry. There are many, many more in Matthew 8 and 9 and throughout the Gospels, but I'm going to focus on the first one, the 2 blind men, in the first few verses here, 27 through 31. These blind men. It's common, and maybe you've noticed this with someone who's lost their hearing or who is blind, like my friend Erwin has a blind son, and their other senses become more keenly attuned. They can't hear, but their sight is more keenly aware because they have to rely on that other sense. Where in this case, it's not another sense that is being highlighted, it's the faith of these 2 blind men. And it's rather amazing, these 2 blind men who can't physically see who Jesus is and call him Son of David, which is a messianic title. Son of David. While they can't physically see, they can see that Jesus can heal them. D.A. Carson says the Messianic age was characterized as a time when the eyes of the blind would be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. If Jesus was really the Messiah, the blind reason, then Jesus would have mercy on them, and they're right. They're right. Did you hear what Jesus said? Jesus asked them if they believe that he can do this, and they affirm he's able to do it. And then Jesus does something that some call a compassionate gesture. He touches their eyes. He didn't have to do that. At some point out, his word is authoritative. He could have just said, you're healed. Instead, he touches their eyes. Can you imagine that in your mind's eyes? These two blind men before Jesus, they can't see him doing that, right? They can't see him approaching with his hands, and he touches their eyes. Can you see that in your mind's eye? And he heals them. Before he announces that healing, he touches their eyes. I'll come back to that here in a moment. Despite Jesus' command, notice, to not tell anyone, the message puts it, they were hardly out the door before they started blabbing to everyone they met about what Jesus did for them. I don't want to go into this so much, but this is one of those secrecy sayings, so-called secrecy sayings in the Gospels, where Jesus says, don't tell anybody I did this for you. Usually the people go out and tell everybody what Jesus did for them. Part of the reason for that, some suggest maybe Jesus, like in John, he'll say that my hour has not yet come. Or some suggest maybe it's to try to avoid unnecessary hostility. But in verse 34, we see that the Pharisees are already getting hostile towards Jesus. Whatever the reason, this proves impossible for these two blind men who can now see, and they spread the news about what Jesus has done for them throughout the entire region and district. Jesus didn't have to do that. He touches their eyes, and he invites us to have that same compassion for the harassed and helpless, the lost and broken, the hurting and the sick. I'm not trying to be gross, but to be moved in the bowels for others. Here's a second insight about compassion then. Christ-like compassion listens to cries for mercy, sees those who are often ignored, and touches those who are hurting. If you go back through Matthew, you notice that Jesus does things he didn't have to do. In Matthew 8, he touches a leper. He would have been considered unclean by doing that, but it is an act and compassion, a compassionate gesture towards them. He didn't have to touch these two blind men to heal them, but he did it as well, and they would have sensed not only heard his words, but they would have felt his hands. Did you pick up on that? Jesus touches them. Perhaps that's why the church lays hands on one another as we pray for each other. Perhaps that's why when we anoint people for healing, it involves touch. At the hospital, Shirley and others, I've witnessed it, will hold Rick's hand by the bedside. Touch. There's something about human touch that communicates and expresses concern and care and compassion. Now, I know not everybody likes to be touched, but overall, that's what human touch communicates. Let me give you an example. Bruce Thielman says, I read recently of a teaching hospital that found one of its youngest residents or students had a marvelous effect on children. They responded to him with delight. They would do things for him and yield to his directions in a way that they wouldn't do for any other person on staff. And they couldn't figure out why, so they assigned a nurse to pay attention to what he did to try to figure out what his secret was. And she was with him for 2 weeks before she learned what he was doing. On the last round of the night before he went home, he would go to each child, each one, and give them a hug and tuck them into bed himself. It was this act of compassion, this mercy towards them that strengthened their bond with one another. And he says it's that compassion, that kind of compassion that belongs to Jesus that reaches out to each of us. The healing of the two blind men is just one example of many of Jesus' compassionate ministry, his healing ministry. And this is messianic activity, as read from Matthew chapter 11 this morning by David. If you go through all those examples that Jesus says to tell John's messengers, you can match them up with Jesus' ministry of what he's been doing. He heals the blind and the lame and the sick. He does all the things that Messiah would be said to do in Isaiah 35 and other places. All these point to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah, just as these two blind men said and confessed. Son of David, have mercy on me. Craig Keener adds, Matthew relates these narratives to encourage us concerning the character and power of the one we serve. I had you think about that a little bit this morning with the reflection on 2 Corinthians chapter 1. The power and character of the one we serve. In Sunday school this morning, the teens had a list of not all, but most of the names of God, and were asked to think about how each one of those titles might address their own circumstances or the trouble that they might be in. To think about the character of the one we serve, Jesus. So that's just a couple of examples from the life and ministry of Jesus. But then in verses 35 through 38, it uses that word what we've been working with. I wish I could say it because it's kind of a fun word to say, but I can't do the accents that you have to use, so I won't even try. But it's that word that means to be moved in the bowels, to be punched in the gut because of the situation and circumstances of another person. Verses 35 through 38, Jesus has compassion on the crowds. He sees that they're harassed and helpless, and his heart goes out to him. And this doesn't mean he just sees people as a mass. As we've already seen in these stories here, he interacts with, it seems like, each one he heals, one by one. He doesn't just wave his hand and says, okay, you're all healed. No, each one he is speaking with, touching, listening to. And his heart goes out to all of them in our text today, in the rest of it. When he sees the crowds, he has compassion. Look at verses 35 through 38 of chapter 9. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. There's our summary of his ministry again. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. There's that threefold pattern of ministry that I alluded to earlier: teaching and preaching and healing. And Craig Keener points out he devoted himself to go everywhere he could, all the cities and towns. All those are necessary to reach people. He's not just doing one and not the other two. All three combined. Roger Hahn points out, compassion alone is incomplete without the teaching and preaching about the kingdom. But it is compassion that's being highlighted here, and it becomes a tangible expression of the kingdom of God being proclaimed. So when Jesus looked over the crowds, his heart broke, and then he healed them. He ministered to them. Roger Hahn says this is one of the places that affirm compassion as the reason for the healing miracles. However, verse 36 does not identify sickness and disease as the reason for his compassion. It was the disruption of their lives and the loss of God's peace that seemed to move Jesus. He saw them as harassed and beaten down like sheep without a shepherd, and healing was his response to this emotional disintegration. The message puts it, he healed their diseased bodies, healed their bruised and hurt lives. Harassed and helpless. You know what those words mean? Harassed means to be distressed, confused, bullied, and oppressed. He sees all these people. He can see it and know every one of their needs, every one of their hurts, every one of their troubles. Helpless means to be dispirited, thrown down, listen to this, prostrated by fatigue and hunger and want of care. And here's the third insight about compassion. Jesus says the harvest fields around us are full of those kind of folks. Harassed and helpless, dispirited, fatigued. They don't know where they're going. They don't have a shepherd in their life. They don't have the Lord in their life. They are in need of compassion. They're in need of the good news of the kingdom. Who is going to go to them? Because church, most of the time, they aren't going to come to us. And Jesus says, look at the harvest field. Look at all these hurting people around you. Look at all the broken people around you. Look at all the lost people around you. Look at the sick and needy around you. They need someone to bring them the good news of the kingdom and the compassion of Jesus. And he calls the church to go in his name by the power of the Holy Spirit and continue on his work for his glory. We receive the comfort and consolation. We receive his ministry. But did you hear from 2 Corinthians? It isn't meant to just be hoarded ourselves. We're to extend it to others. And there are all these hurting people all around us. Do we see them? Are we listening to their cries for mercy? Are we willing to get in the messiness of it? Because it is a mess. And Jesus says, pray that the Lord of the harvest will send more workers into the harvest. And I would say Jesus has in mind the kind of compassionate, merciful workers that he himself has displayed among the hurting masses. Jesus calls his disciples and us to pray for the Lord of the harvest to send out workers. But I don't want you to just write that in your prayer list today. I want you to take heed and warning of this. This isn't just some kind of benign request. Okay, yeah, I'll pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers. No. It's not a benign request at all. In fact, the NASB puts it a little bit more strongly, beseech the Lord of the harvest. It is a very strong word. The word study tells us it means to plead as to beg and bind oneself with a request. In other words, Jesus seems to be telling the disciples and us, when you pray about this, when you ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers, really mean it, really want that to happen, but it also seems to suggest that we would be willing to be among the laborers. To bind ourselves with that request would seem to mean, yes, Lord, send me. So he says to ask. And I wish that the chapter didn't break there, because if you go to chapter 10, Jesus then goes on to send the apostles out to do that, gives them the authority and the equipping to do that work among the masses, among the people. This relates to this theme. This is not just our theme. This is USA Canada Church of the Nazarene. This is the theme for 2025 and of this sermon series, bringing people to Jesus. Doesn't that assume that we're among the laborers? Bringing people to Jesus. Who's going to do that? Who's going to be part of that assignment? Jesus says, pray in such a way that you're willing to be part of the work. And maybe that's continuing on in prayer. Not everybody can help somebody move and do that physically speaking, but there is a way that the Lord would want to involve you in his work to the hurting and the harassed and the broken and the lost. What would that be? It might require that there would be a revival in our own hearts of this compassion that we see in Jesus. This movement of the bowels, if you will. It might require that the Lord would have to give us a fresh compassion, or as Colossians puts it, clothe yourselves with compassion, the compassion of Christ. Matt Woodley recognized that need in his own heart. A revival in his own heart. He's a pastor. He writes this: 2 years ago, I nearly ditched the pastorate because I started focusing on the negatives of my job. Saturday night sermon anxiety attacks, the disintegrating basement tiles in the parsonage, and on and on. After 8 years of frantically trying to meet needs and please people, tracking down plant stands for weddings, I could identify only trace amounts of spiritual growth in the congregation, and I sensed this dangerous ice slowly spread throughout my heart. The ice of cynicism. the ice of pastoral sloth, an attitude that didn't care if people changed because, of course, they didn't want to anyway. But God didn't answer his prayer for escape. Instead, he renewed his call to ministry through 3 little children at a playground. He said it happened when we were on vacation in Libby, Montana. I went to an elementary school playground, and I was praying and reading there when 3 children approached me and just plopped down next to me by the swing and asked if they could be there. And before I could say no or move, they started in on their dysfunctional story. The oldest, a 12-year-old, Deanna, said, "Hi, my name's Deanna. I'm 12. My sister's Christy. She's 10. And Mikey," she wasn't being very nice to her brother, apparently, "doesn't he look fat in that Lion King t-shirt? He's 6 years old." And he said, "We're siblings, but we all actually have 3 different dads. My dad's dead. Christy's dad has disappeared. And Mikey's dad has beaten him up so many times that our mom is divorcing the creep." Wondering if he was wondering where the mother was, they answered that question too. "Well, my mom and her new fiance, Larry, needed a break from us kids, so they went to the casino, got us this burrito from the gas station next door, and told us to stay here for 2 hours in the park. Can we stay here with you?" Probably didn't anticipate having a conversation with kids in that circumstance. In order to be polite, I said, "Yes, you can stay here." And then I asked if they lived in town. "No," Deanna, this family spokesman, answered again. "We used to live in town, but my mom lost her job, and now we're living in a tent. I don't like living in a tent. By the way, what's your job?" "Well, I'm a pastor," he said. And after a long silence, Deanna said, "Can I ask you something? I've heard these stories about Jesus who went around helping and healing and loving people. Why isn't he doing that anymore?" And he began to give a theological answer to kids, which he recognized quickly wasn't the right approach. He started to talk about the incarnation and all this, and he could just see that they weren't getting any of that. And he saw into their love-hungry eyes, and he said, let me start all over. Let me start all over. And with tears welling up in his eyes, he said, "Let me tell you kids, do you realize how much Jesus loves you?" And he said it wasn't what he had anticipated happening or what he wanted to happen necessarily, but the Lord used these 3 little children to open his eyes and his heart again toward the compassion of Jesus. These 3 little children that appeared in the park next to him. He realized that he had stopped, and I'm using my language here, but I'm interpreting what happened here. He stopped seeing, listening, and touching with Christ-like compassion. And perhaps we can detect something like that happening in our own hearts and lives. The people just become a big mass of people, and we don't see them, we don't hear them, we don't get involved, we don't want to be part of the mess. We just leave that to somebody else. Let somebody else do it. The Lord is asking us to pray for the Lord of the harvest to send out workers among the harassed and helpless, and that includes, Lord, yes, even me. What does that look like? We didn't sing the song this morning. We were going to sing it, Revive Us Again. Maybe that's what needs to happen in our own hearts and lives, to be clothed with Christ-like compassion again for these lost ones, for these hurting ones. Let me give you the 3 insights again, and then we're going to listen to a song that I hope will help us. 3 insights about compassion from our text. First, compassion is more than a feeling, more than a sentimental tear. Compassion moves us, that word is intentionally used, moves us to act on behalf of another. You know, the bowel movement moves us to act on behalf of another. Second, Christ-like compassion listens to the cries for mercy, and I would say doesn't ignore them, sees those who are often ignored, and touches the hurting. And then third, Jesus says the harvest is filled with such people, these lost and hurting ones, these sick and harassed ones, these helpless ones, those in need of compassion and the good news of the kingdom, who will go? He says, pray to send laborers into the harvest. And may that include you and me.